Say there, stranger, remember me? I'm that stranger who stalks your sanity. So how about it? Are you vulnerable? And if you are, how do you handle it? Now let's get the game straight here. I'm talking, you're listening, and you're commenting in the section below. So let's you and I agree that I'm talking about being ingenuous, and for the purposes of the monologue, because it's not a dialogue, unfortunately, for the purposes of the monologue right now, we're accepting a provisional equation. To be ingenuous means to be innocent. So, is innocence vulnerable? This is the question. Is your innocence vulnerable? Is your physical person vulnerable? Are you emotionally vulnerable? These are directions in which the issue can go. Now, once again, I want to remind you and encourage you strongly to apply the 5-phase model, the morphology of the emergent self. So to remind you of how this model works, it assumes that every one of those 5 stages, in every case, the earlier stage inheres in a later stage. So you can plot them in linear time, of course, but you can also plot them simultaneously. So you could say that the first rule of the recovering adult child is to realize that these previous stages inhere in your behavior now. So here's an example. Apply the question of vulnerability in the framework of the 5 stages. So the infant stage, or phase 1, is birth to 3 years. Is the infant vulnerable? Absolutely, in every way you can imagine. Second stage, the home child, from the age of 3 to the age of 10. Is the home child vulnerable? Yes, in certain ways, but not as much as the helpless, defenseless, innocent infant. So suppose, for example, that a young girl at the age of 8, that's the second phase, faces an issue or situation in life where she needs to learn to define her boundaries and protect her boundaries. In other words, to protect her vulnerability. If at that stage, at the age of 8, something happens and her guardian does not show her the issue of boundaries, does not explain what boundaries are, and does not teach her the lesson that needs to be learned at that age about defining and protecting boundaries, then the girl will experience what is called a maturity stop at that age. And later on, in phase 3, teenhood, or phase 4, young adulthood, and even in phase 5, the mature adult, she will encounter that maturity stop. What was not fulfilled, the need that was not fulfilled at the age of 8 will play ahead into the later stages. Now, there are blatant examples of this problem in our society today. You all know that for a while, a certain righteous, entitled, and very demonstrative minority of people are claiming that they don't feel safe. They're going on TikTok videos, they're going all over the internet and making a big issue about how they don't feel safe over the slightest issue whatsoever, including things that people say. What you are seeing there is a blatant demonstration of children who are not recovering adult children. They are terminally damaged adult children who who are bringing up the issue of safety at a later age due to the fact that in the home child phase, 3 to 10, or even later on, they didn't face the issue then and there. Their guardian, whoever it was, parent or some mentor or concerned person in their environment, in the familial environment, which includes neighbors and trusted people, in the home child phase, that need was not met. They could not establish the capacity to define their boundaries and know how to protect themselves. They carried that forward into life, and you have the atrocious behavior of people who are damaged and handicapped in their development, who are now demanding that others do things so that they can feel safe when it's their own responsibility to feel safe. And by the way, I want to point out a meme from the recovery movement which hits you square between the eyes, and don't you ever forget it. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. You get that? So, if your issue, if any issue concerning boundaries or anything else was not met and mastered in an earlier phase, it's not your fault it happened that way, but it is your responsibility to do something about it if you intend to become a recovering adult child. Clear enough? Now let's go on to the question, you and I, of how to handle vulnerability. Now I'm going to separate that into two categories. One is vulnerability to physical aggression and harm, and the other is other kinds of vulnerability, particularly emotional vulnerability or mental vulnerability. What is mental vulnerability? It is the condition where you are open to being intimidated and mentally challenged and mentally pushed around by others. Now, it would be a very great thing, and it is a very wonderful thing, and I know cases of this from my close allies, that they begin to teach the child in the home child phase or in early teen years after 10 or 11 martial arts and arts of self-defense. I consider it imperative in the future that any guardians of children have the responsibility to teach them about physical vulnerability and how to defend themselves. But I'm going to set aside that issue for a moment and look at the issue of mental and emotional vulnerability. So are you emotionally vulnerable? Well, another way to put that is, can your feelings be hurt? How easily can your feelings be hurt? How easily can you be mentally challenged, intimidated, and defeated by someone else who perhaps has not the best intentions toward you? You see today, going back to that case of the entitled and outrageous, marginalized, damaged children who are demanding that other people do things so that they feel safe, well, you see, they exercise intimidation. They make it other people's fault that they do not feel safe in a personal situation or a social environment. They don't have a safe space, and they make it someone else's fault because they can't deal with that. You see how illuminating this 5-phase cycle is. And remember always that you're not a child who grew up to be an adult. You're a child who is perpetually becoming an adult. And it's your responsibility to manage that. So how do you manage vulnerability? Well, what is vulnerability? Let's look at the word for a moment. It comes from the Latin word vulnus, meaning wound, and the suffix ability, so it means the ability to be wounded. Now, this is a very important distinction semantically because it raises the issue, well, how can you be wounded? You can be wounded emotionally in a way that disables you or handicaps you or in some way prevents you from acting authentically and effectively. But you can be wounded and recover. So there are two possibilities of vulnerability. If you are able to be wounded, first possibility, you are wounded and you cannot recover. Second possibility, second option, you are wounded and you can recover. So I'll use myself as a first-person example. Am I vulnerable? I'm tremendously vulnerable, and I choose to be vulnerable. I do not defend myself against being emotionally wounded. I do not defend my feelings against being hurt by anyone. Go ahead and give it a try. I'd love to see you try. And if anyone tries to hurt my feelings or intimidate me mentally, I simply watch how they do it. I do not defend myself by creating a boundary that ultimately and totally prevents me from being wounded. I am vulnerable. I am always able to be wounded. Why? Because I am able to handle that wound in such a way that it doesn't disable or harm me. This is an extremely important distinction. So one of the goals of the recovering adult child is not to shut down, not to become so emotionally guarded that no one in any way can hurt your feelings. You don't need to do that. In fact, it's bad to do that. Keep your field of emotions open. Keep your mental field open, but at the same time, take responsibility for being capable of rolling with the punches and handling anything coming from outside that is intended to hurt you or intended to intimidate you. You don't have to protect yourself from it in an absolute sense of not allowing it to happen. In fact, you can't not allow it to happen. You protect yourself with the confident capacity that anything that comes at you that might hurt or intimidate you, you can handle it. It's like Aikido. Let the adversary come on. Let them move towards you. Let them make their moves. Let them say what they want. Not do what they want, because we're not talking about physical harm here. We're not talking about defending yourself from physical harm. Is that clear so far? I repeat, to be vulnerable means to be able to be wounded and to recover. The true man is vulnerable. The true hero is vulnerable. One of the themes that you continually find in ancient legends of heroes is how they were harmed in battle. They were harmed in hand combat with swords and jousting, spears, and so forth. And they recovered. Isn't it a theme that you see in superhero movies or even in the old hero movies of the 80s and 90s, like, Die Hard? What did the actor in Die Hard, Bruce Willis, what did he represent as a heroic figure? Well, he was brutalized, he was shot, he was beaten, but he recovered. You can't say that he was invulnerable in the sense that he didn't allow himself to be hurt. He was invulnerable in the sense that he was hurt and managed to recover from being hurt. That's what it means to be vulnerable, not that you are shut down and you live in the illusion that no one can ever try to harm you, to offend you, to intimidate you mentally, or to attack you emotionally. So children in the home child phase need to be taught by their guardians how to defend themselves against bullies who try to hurt them emotionally and possibly physically. And if they are taught those lessons at that stage of childhood, then later on in teen years and young adult years, they will handle it correctly. If they are not taught in those earlier years, they will have a maturity stop. In any situation that comes to them, they will find that in any situation that comes to them where they need to define and defend their boundaries, they are incapable of doing so, and thus the reaction will be pathological. And you see it everywhere in society. This whole big deal about people not feeling safe and making it the responsibility of others to act in a certain way so they feel safe only applies to those who are handicapped and damaged adult children. And those who can see that behavior for what it is, that entitled righteous behavior, will look at it in a completely neutral and dispassionate way and say those three great words that balance out the three great words, I love you. I don't care. I don't care if you don't feel safe. It's not my fault, and it's not my responsibility. And in that way, you will defend yourself against the insane assault of those damaged and handicapped children. So finally, to make it perfectly clear one more time, to be invulnerable does not mean that you can prevent someone from attempting to hurt you. But you can recover immediately from that happening when it happens, in the moment that it happens, not later. You can hold your ground and still be vulnerable. It's desirable to be vulnerable because it means the capacity to accept and handle an effect upon your feelings. Do you want to go through the world, and more people, unfortunately, tragically, are making this choice? I'm going to go through the world pretending that no one can affect me and no one is going to hurt my feelings. What does that go into? It goes into solitude. It goes into desperation. It goes into the status of many third phase children today in their teen years who are completely cut off from contact. To stand before others in any situation, personal or social, and act as if no one can affect you is to isolate yourself and put yourself on a path to solitude, bad solitude, to despair, and to suicide. And why are the suicide rates of third phase adult children going sky high? That's not the solution. It's a good thing to be vulnerable. I like being vulnerable. I don't mind feeling affected by someone who tries to emotionally attack me because I can handle being vulnerable. So yes, to be ingenuous and innocent means to be vulnerable. If you want to stay alive, if you want to keep your ingenuousness and your innocence alive, you have to accept being vulnerable. And it's actually a strength rather than a weakness. Can you see that? Now that's about all I want to say, but I do want to add that I have been pondering the question, one of the many questions that might arise over this issue. Can that primordial, ingenuous innocence in you be damaged? Can it ultimately be damaged? This is a question that I look at very closely, and I don't have an answer to it right now, but I will get back to it. My tendency is to believe that there is something in the primordial, ingenuous purity of the human child that can never be damaged or corrupted. That's my tendency to think that. But upon reflection, I realize that assumption has to be examined more closely and qualified, and perhaps I'll pick up that issue again in a forthcoming talk in the Great Recovery. And until then, as always, I'll be seeing you in the beauty that kills.